We're going to talk about three common mistakes, and this is all experience-based. So certainly there's room for dissent and opinion, and the content here is really my own experience and opinion for what it's worth. You're welcome to utilize any parts of the content for your own purposes if it's helpful. Um, yeah, let's just go through. So first of all, who am I? If you haven't attended any of the past webinars or training sessions that I've done, I work with Scrutiny. I'm a co-founder. It's a managed security services provider in the UK, founded about 7 years ago, and I'm an advisor to the company, um, helping address customer security issues, both on their current program management, their strategy, certainly incidents, and ongoing maintenance of their security posture. I also work as a venture partner with a cybersecurity focused venture capital firm called ForgePoint Capital. I've written a few books. If you Google me, you'll find more information than I appreciate is out there about me, unfortunately. But thankfully, most of it is positive. So I won't bore you beyond that. Today's topics are, as you can see on the screen, a bit of tongue-in-cheek, describing issues I've seen with cybersecurity program management and issues with product selection and maintenance, and then and including the cybersecurity posture maintenance, and then unfortunately the way that I've observed organizations historically most often addressed incident response. So I'm calling it the philosophy of cyber, but as I mentioned, it's just sort of tongue-in-cheek. I will, for purposes of transparency, Schrödinger's security, I thought was my own concept. I woke up one morning and thought, hey, that's a clever title. I talked to a few friends about the idea, and my partners at Scrutiny, and said, why don't we do a presentation on this? And then one of them sent me a link. My old colleagues from Silence at BlackBerry actually produced a very useful blog on the same subject. So on the one hand, I thought it was my own idea. On the other hand, I appreciate that someone else sees the same problem, and actually in the same context that I do. But the lessons, as you can see, someone's made a comment, cybersecurity run by cats seems like a pretty cool idea. That's true, or herding cats is what I typically call it, or cat rodeo. The first that we'll talk about today is going to be Pavlov's products. And if you're not familiar with these philosophies or these contributors, Pavlov was a scientist who used a dog, a bell, and some food to observe trained behavior. So essentially, and an electric probe, unfortunately. So essentially, he observed with training that whenever the bell rang, then the dog would eat, and he trained the dog not to eat in other circumstances. But basically, it's observed behavior described by others or by outside forces. And I'll talk some more about it. But the lesson I've learned is most security purchasing is done on the basis of brand and peer influence, particularly by the Gartner quadrant, Magic Quadrant positioning of products. And there's some challenges there that we'll discuss. The second is Schrödinger security, which Schrödinger was a gent that postulated that a cat in a box with some radiation. The question is, was the cat alive or dead? If you open the box, you run the risk of killing the cat. So the question posed really was, what do you know about what's in the box? And that's the perspective that we'll discuss with regard to cybersecurity posture and hygiene. because, and I've got some statistics to share with you as well from the audits and incident responses that Scrutiny has performed over the past few years, that exhibit these challenges that can largely be addressed with proper maintenance and awareness. And then Three Monkeys incident response: hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. It's unfortunately become something of a risk management posture or approach for a lot of executives with the variety of incidents that they experience, or at least those that I've helped them to address. And it's a significant challenge to overcome because of fears of regulatory or litigatory or brand and reputation issues. And it really specifically brings out the point that security is not a directive, and it's not as yet a strategic imperative for organizations as much as a support function in most cases, either misunderstood for the advantages it offers in corporate strategy, or subjected or subordinated to other strategic interests. So we'll talk some more about those as well. A few questions have popped up all about cats. We'll talk about that some more. So just getting into it, first of all, this is a mind map, or it's not so much a mind map as a program map of the CISO's job, the Chief Information Security's job. And it's not meant to be an eye exercise here for you to read all the content, but through a variety of best practices in industry or industry auditing standards, such as, for example, ISACA supports and promotes, and peer development of programs across industry, and then to some extent due to legal imperatives on organizations. This is one of the best demonstrations of security program management that the CISO is responsible for. It includes and incorporates the relationships and the peering relationships with other organizational members, and how it fits into the internal and external environments. It is daunting. There is a link to the diagram at the lower right. It's in small print. And there are different versions of this as well. If you Google the CISO Mind Map, it will provide you a lot of these types of diagrams. This was from 2021, and it's interesting. But ultimately, what does this mean in context of what we're talking about, particularly with Pavlov's products as a start? What does it mean? Essentially, every CISO that's presented or comes into a new organization and is presented with the challenge of securing internal, external, partner, and related relationships and organizational efforts, needs a place to start. And that should ultimately be based upon why. What are the challenges facing them? What are the imperatives by the risk environment, by the regulatory environment that they're in, and so on. So rather than just simply applying a standard or an approach like a CIS-20 or an ISO 27000 or something, instead, I over the years, over more than 30 years as it happens, I've come to advise CISOs and security leaders of organizations that they should start with the why question and evaluate what the paramount risks are and work down the mountain to address them. So talking about Pavlov's products, I mentioned today it's an unfortunate observation that much of security spend is based on brand prominence, and particularly on the Gartner quadrants. If you're not in Gartner top performer category, then it's very difficult to make it through, not necessarily the CISOs or their security engineering teams, but rather the procurement and product approval process with large organizations. And the approvals for purchasing are largely gate-kept by people that read magazines and see advertising by those Gartner quadrant top performers. And I'd say at least 10 to 15% of my time with clients is spent helping them redress the question from the CFO or the CEO or the board of why didn't they purchase IBM Global Security Services as their MSSP rather than a local MSSP? Why didn't they purchase CrowdStrike versus perhaps Huntress or a Sophos or something that's lower cost and might be better suited to their environment? Because the influence of marketing and advertising has driven a lot of the discussion that those executives that hold the reins of purchasing power in organizations, the discussions that they have with their peers at the club, at the board level, certainly with shareholders, that for the most part is not as aware of the specifics of the need of certain cybersecurity products and the ability of those top market performers to actually deal with those specific needs rather than dealing with generic overall applications of security. So as an example, and I hope you'll forgive me some of the graphics I've chosen, but on the left, you can see, and you're very familiar, I'm certain, with the variety of security product needs and service needs, whether it's identity and trust, risk and governance, business continuity, the ability to detect, respond, and manage. And you'll notice there's no product names in here. These are just the security risk management functional activities. You can lay in, a dozen or more products or services on top of each of these categories, and it becomes a very complex bingo card of what you have available and how it fits back to this mind map. One unfortunate knee-jerk reaction is because of the complexity that this is all created. The one product that most security organizations over rely on has become EDR, in my opinion. And so much of the problems could actually be addressed more completely and more successfully through system hardening, through AD sanitization, through network segmentation, multi-factor authentication. It's shocking that 20 years in, we're still talking about the advantages, not even the mandate, but the advantages of multi-factor authentication. Those four capabilities, the ability to control who has access when and why with multi-factor authentication in a secure one-time use, the ability to segment or bulkhead network segments from each other such that someone in shipping can't actually get into someone in finance's computer and look around at the payroll data, or system hardening. We've all seen the issues around 0 days and single days that are being exploited both on and off the internet, and then Active Directory with its rights management, entitlements management, and just the sanitization of password policies and enforcement of rules like 90-day change and that sort of thing. those common activities of security program management are more successful than any appendage product, whether it be an IDS or EDR or DRM or DLP. Those appendage products can only help to enforce your security posture strength. They can't replace the posture deficiencies. So at Scrutiny, we have a process of starting with why when we're helping clients. We do audits on the initiation of a client relationship, and then on a monthly or quarterly basis thereafter, we'll re-audit and come back with why should your program be focused on which problems. This is an example actually of an audit output where a client had actually been compromised in a very active breach, and we came in, and most of the time, and indeed this client thought that they needed to replace their AV with EDR and get some managed detect and response capabilities. But with our audit method, we actually were able to show them, look, you've got a bigger problem, actually twice the size problem with user behavior control than you do with service configuration. By the way, malware, as it was used in this case and all other cases I've seen its use, is literally just another service configuration. It's a remote access service. It's a remote command execution service. It's an automation service of some type of facility. But in this particular case, so this is on the back end of the incident and dealing with shoring up or remediating the security posture deficiencies. We were able to tell them, contrary to what guidance that they were getting from, in their case, the finance officer, based on influence being leveraged by a particular EDR vendor. In fact, their ability to control how users interact with services, endpoints, and data was the deficiency that not only was the largest deficiency in their security posture, but it was also, as we found in the root cause analysis of the incident investigation, the most prominent method utilized in the compromise through not only gaining access with unprotected external service facilities through the VPN on unpatched systems without MFA, but also no effective password change policy in their Active Directory, a really loose Active Directory entitlements management, and RBAC configuration with varied group strengths. And then no PAM, which consequently allowed and was exploited by lateral movement without additional tooling, just utilizing the tools available in the estate already. And so in the end, the evidence proved that unless or until they actually addressed user behavior, security posture issues of their program, really nothing else matters. Adding an appendage EDR product would not solve the base problem of every user having local administrative rights to their endpoints, or the unnecessary vast arsenal of Active Directory accounts that had local admin rights granted through a lot of outdated profiles that unfortunately had local share as well, that just hadn't been tended to over time. And so the key here, going back to this concept of Pavlov's product, EDR is sensational and sexy right now. Gives you a lot of telemetry, a lot of instrumentation about what the perceived problem is, because it's tuned to identify those rogue callouts or those malicious file system and file path manipulations and service stubs. Um, but services are subject to users. The configuration of services is subject to the rights and the controls that you allow the users. And as demonstrated in this, and indeed most cases and incidents, um, unless a security program addresses user um, profiles, rights, entitlements, and access and control methods, they'll never be able to get a handle on the opportunities to manipulate services with zero-day exploits, or through the use of EDR, HIDs, or DRM, or other utilities that are just, as I mentioned, appendages to the program. And that's the whole concept of Pavlov's products, by the way. Going to EDR, just a couple of examples. I'll start in the lower right, because as EDR is sexy as a concept in advertising, there are some issues around EDR as well, and you shouldn't over-rely on it. Aside from the point I just made about first address your users and the ability to use systems and services. The other problems are, so certainly EDR suffers like antivirus and FIM and other products in its ability to address 0 days, because 0 days are innovative. That's the point of a 0 day. But there's a lot of misunderstanding about this concept of 0 day. Practically speaking, a 0 day means 0 people know about it other than the author. Once more than 0 people know about it other than the author, it becomes what's called a single day, or 1 day, single day, or a half day at least. That's because then the information starts to share. Ways to sharing becomes leaks or research and testing and public exploits, and ultimately campaigners that utilize those exploits. Also with single days, though, come patches and fixes or workarounds. And EDR is good with single days, and to some extent even half days. But even the more advanced EDR like SentinelOne, CrowdStrike, and so on, Sophos has got some good capabilities. Even those that are looking for the same types of vulnerable entry points in process memory, memory hopping through processes, file system exploits, credential or entitlements exploits, that sort of thing. They're still only capable of addressing a certain amount of those because of the complexity and the innovation of these exploit kits. The other category, though, that's important to realize is what's called the forever day or I day. And this is where everyone knows about it, or at least everyone that needs to know or wants to know. The information's out there, as are the exploit kits, but there are no patches because ultimately they can't be patched. Some examples of this, of course, are in IoT, where you may actually have to replace the device, which may not be possible if the device is, sensors on a rail network, or temperature sensors in a nuclear control facility, or its network of other nuclear control facilities, or HMI on for PLCs on oil platforms in the Gulf of Mexico or something. It's a much more complex issue when you're dealing with high availability systems or mission critical systems, which unfortunately largely have passed their end of life with vendors that may not even exist anymore. And it becomes as much of a product planning and operational strategy. And it doesn't have to be as extreme as power industry, for example. It could be, warehouse stock management, or it could be retail EPOS and that sort of thing. Some of these things are unpatchable because either the vendors are no longer available, but you can't simply rip and replace the capabilities without dramatically impacting the company or the industry. Some of them you just can't you just can't fix them. It's in the nature of the construct of the operating system of the computers that you rely on. And so it's important to be able to distinguish between those. It's also useful to understand the types of malware and how they're used in order to really critically assess the product assembly and security program efforts around monitoring, prioritization, and response playbooks, and investigations decisions. I've unfortunately seen a lot of investigations and incident response generated on first stage malware indicators off the back of Mandant or Red Cloak or other managed detect and respond services. And first stage malware are these phishing links. There are these exploits for these zero, singular, forever days. There are these dropper downloaders that are intended to enlist computers in a botnet. Or they're the scripts. They don't represent the same risk as, or rather I should say, they don't represent the same threat as the later second or third stage, where second, as you can see, is meant to expand the access through lateral movement and manipulation of the environment and its security posture deficiencies, or the stage three, where the intent is to control through backdoor Trojans and remote administrative services and controls today, which more often are the organization's own VPN and help desk utilities like VNC or SolarWinds or other utilities that the enterprise uses for help desk. Then, as we'd seen in the mid-2000s with Poison Ivy or Ghost or Dridex or other backdoor Trojans. Unfortunately, far fewer in my experience, again, it's limited to my own experience, of far fewer of the incident requests and investigations have been generated based on stage three, or even indeed stage two activities than stage one. And mostly it's because the security programs are highly tuned and largely based upon the influence of the marketing campaigns to identify the, quote, millions of attacks that an organization suffers through phishing. Really? Phishing is an attack? I'd say it certainly might be a test of security defenses and perimeters, but the attack really isn't evident unless or until it results in an ungoverned access and an uncontrolled use of the environment to achieve an actual purpose or an objective. And so having, as I often say, a well-tended garden such that the grass in your lawn is all the same height, having consistent builds, having consistent entitlements and control over user accounts and service configurations. As a security program objective or design will help you identify where those actual attacks are occurring and enable the alerting of the high value incidents rather than always detailing and responding to the, quote, millions of attacks that are generated by DOS testing or penetration attempts of your firewalls or the phishing and water holing alerts. So cyber is, it's not only about the things that your products can identify, these appendage products like EDR and IDS and smart firewalls, CASB and things like that. It's also about the entitlements management and control, as I mentioned about users. It's also about the configuration and indeed the expected use and network connections with services by the functions of the organization. And again, that's where UBA has an advantage. User behavior analytics has an advantage over EDR because EDR, um, although some like CrowdStrike and SentinelOne do allow you to ask questions like a UBA. You have to have some kind of preliminary event that's alerting a suspicious activity that will cause you to ask the question. Unlike UBA, and I don't mean UBA or UEBA as a product, but rather as a security program effort, which will address entitlements and use rights and patterns of use by the function that that person performs in the organization, which can lead to better fidelity of understanding whether the millions of phishing alerts matter versus the lateral movement across the enterprise by Greg and shipping into Bob's computer in finance. Just so you understand the intersection of how cybercrimes are committed, essentially, and I always say this, an actor needs three things. They need a tool of some kind. Most often that today is going to be one of your tools. They'll just borrow it out of your toolkit. So whether it's VNC or RDP, of Fortinet access, whatever it is, they need a tool, they need a credential that most often from the outside today, they can look for passwords that have been exposed or compromised and either purchase their use or just in unfortunately a lot of cases, just Google them to find exposed passwords and use those, because most organizations don't practice good Active Directory hygiene with password change policy enforcement, which is a policy enforcement around 90-day change is it's a pain, of course, for the end user. But it's also practically one of the simplest things and most effective at controlling ungoverned access to your environment. And then especially if you add on multi-factor authentication that challenges them for a second factor. And then they need time. And time is where your security program management efforts and your program definition has the best opportunity to protect your environment in an active defense posture with tools like multi-factor authentication and digital loss protection, data loss protection, EDR, XDR, monitoring and response, that sort of thing. But time is the thing that you want to make your advantage as a security program manager. Time is the thing that attackers are trying to take advantage of in their technical methods. There's a difference between active defensive posture and passive defensive posture that you can consider in your security program. And I've included this. This is how I've addressed with organizations to evaluate their tooling, their policies, and the processes that they operate. Where it comes down to effectively, though, is who needs what kind of product for what purpose? This question of why. In legal, I've found legal organizations or legal functions of business, digital rights management, and to some extent data leakage protection is the most important appendage product to help to secure or protect the organization from that legal function, the access to information that's protected. And next to that, CASB as a digital data leakage prevention, and then EDR, of course, to identify suspicious activities. But it differs from finance, where finance mostly today uses cloud services or remote services to interact with payroll providers, with expense management, with corporate finances, and so on. And so MFA is the most critical product appendage that will help you gain an active defensive posture that prevents penetration of the organization. Whereas IT, the most important thing for the IT people and the function within the organization is EDR. But associated to that is going to be PAM and VPN. And of course, with VPN, you always want to include an MFA. Customer service, because they're mostly interacting with clients and sharing information back and forth, and more commonly are relying on cloud stored data. CASB is really important to see what information is being accessed and transferred to whom when. It's much more important than EDR because they're mostly interacting with cloud storage, where EDR is mostly focused and almost entirely focused on the endpoint and local storage or local application use. And then executives, and this is really surprising to most people, but step back from the current paradigm that everyone uses a computer and think about what executives do. In my work with ForgePoint as a venture partner, and even largely in my work with Scrutiny as a co-founder and an executive advisor, 90% of my time is spent on my phone. And so an MDM, that a managed device management capability that enables me to remotely update, inspect, and even wipe that phone is a really important capability, particularly if that executive decides to leave the organization with that phone that they do most of their work on. Okay. Or let's say they decide to take a trip to China or India or someplace where phone spyware is or phone inspection on entry into the country is a thing. MDM is, as I've found, the most important active defense available for protecting the executive function of an organization. So the key here is don't just drop all your appendage products for your program management into a bucket and say, well, we've got EDR, we rely on that. We've got smart firewalls, we rely on that. We've got VPN, we rely on that. But really consider which functions, by the risks of the operations that support the business and its revenue and its contributions to industry, which functions are best supported by which products in an active and a passive defense role, and tune the rules and the observability and response activities according to the capabilities of those products. Schrödinger security. This is about knowing what's in the box. So on the right is the attack model, and I've included a link to the PDF that this is extracted from. Again, it's not meant to be an eye chart. What it says is, there is a model under MITRE that provides the tools, tactics, and procedures that observed actors have used over the past 20 years. And it allows you to build defenses with security program posture, going back to this, and this, such that you can get into a better active and passive capability. There's a book about Schrödinger's backup. I threw a diagram here. It was really funny. So 15 years ago, Jishik wrote about the same issue. People were doing backups, but they weren't actually inspecting the backups to see, did they actually produce expected RTOs and RPOs? And mostly they didn't, and even today they don't. The key is, if you're using technology, use it for the right purposes, tune it to the risks that you're subject to, and then test it. Unless you're actually testing, which is the concept of Schrödinger security, unless you're actually testing, you won't have the ability to observe your performance and know ahead of an incident what the issue is. Now let's talk about ransomware, just as case in point. I mapped this out for a presentation I did with a couple of colleagues in a financial services presentation. And most people think ransomware is either one of mostly two things. Either it's just malware gone mad that locks up your environment, or it's these crafty extortionists stealing your data and holding you hostage against the loss of that data. In fact, it's either, in most situations, both. But I've broken it down from experience into these categories because you need to build playbooks in your testing, your tabletop testing, your interactive testing, to test against these different actor interests, the actions that they perform, the targets that they're prospecting against, the facilities that they'll utilize, the vectors that they'll execute through to achieve the objectives that they have, so that you know how to negotiate based on experience. And so this is sort of a UML, if you will, of just one use case, ransomware, but you can see the complexity of your resulting playbook, both for your MSSP to monitor your SOC, as well, and create rules, as well as your executive communication about the complexity of this this issue that they may think is really simplistic. In fact, I'd say about 20% of the ransomware cases that I've had, ransom wasn't even the objective. The negotiated financial outcome wasn't even the objective. It was either a hacktivist or social activist seeking to disrupt the business for political or societal objectives, or in some cases, it was a disgruntled employee, and in more cases, unfortunately, and more commonly today, it was a market competitor, either a domestic market competitor or an international market competitor seeking to disrupt business processes and services of their competitor in order to achieve some other market advantage. So ransomware is not a simple thing. Indeed, none of the cyber crimes that have been committed ultimately are simplistic. You have to really assess these categories, the actors, their actions, the targets, facilities, vectors, objectives, and response, and model and test these capabilities against your security posture, your program, and the products that you rely on. And the attack framework from MITRE can assist you with that. Then to protect, just continuing on, this is going from active to passive, so continuous attack surface testing and awareness with audits, to extended detect and response with managed services. Ultimately, ransomware is a good use case, and again, you're welcome to any of this content, where there's three practical ways to manage ransomware, or bank your Trojans, or other penetration in your environment. The first is make access unique. The second is restrict lateral movement and use network segmentation. And then the third is ultimately make that data loss irrelevant, either because the data that they have access to really doesn't have any value. And so, keep your key data in controlled storage, or you're able to use some kind of DRM or something that makes the data unusable to them because of encryption capabilities. But those are the three keys, not only to ransomware, but most penetration and manipulation of an environment that I've found. Because the different adversaries have different motivations according to their different objectives, and they target different functions of the organization. Now, the FDIC is an institution in the US that's responsible for insurance over bank deposits. And shockingly, this is the first time, just a week ago, I saw that they put on their webpage playbooks for tabletop exercises. And they've also got videos that are really cheesy. But besides the videos, they have some PDFs, and I'd encourage all of you to go to this US website, download the PDFs, because you can see the types of incidents that they're actually depicting for, in this case, mid-sized banks and community banks. real cyber crimes that have been committed that have business impact on those banks, as opposed to Julian accounting got a phishing email, and testing for user awareness. Rather, they're saying something like, Julian accounting led to customer account takeover that resulted in an unauthorized withdrawal from a corporate account. So these tabletop exercises are addressing the utility of the dependency on technology that different functions of the organizations, in this case banks, have in order to address the cybersecurity posture and instrumentation needs, the tooling, the testing, and the response. And this, in my opinion, is where industry ultimately needs to get to in order for security to be recognized as a partner in the strategy and evolution of organizations. So there's a utopian view that you'll hear from most auditors, especially young auditors, that risk is equal to probability times impact. But operationally, we know that everyone implements compensating controls. Cyber insurers, for example, will mostly today in the questionnaires say that if you have an exposed RDP service to the internet, that they won't underwrite you. Well, I've got a client that's actually a global insurance carrier, and one of their prime MGAs, or MGUs rather, relies on exposed RDP, but they compensate with network isolation, ERM, entitlements, rights management, RBAC, and effective use of DMZs. So they have compensating controls that reduce the probability and impact of the exploitation of that exposed RDP. And they are underwritten by the carrier. That carrier actually has specific guidance against underwriting to exposed RDP. So realistically, you should push back on auditors that might point out deficiencies in their limited experience exist by addressing how you're compensating for those risks, if you're compensating for those risks, or take what they identify on board and look at your security program management and see, is that something that can be addressed with system hardening, network segmentation, MFA, other security program capabilities, rather than just adding on another product, because you don't want to end up in a place like this. Now, I mentioned Scrutiny. We do a lot of audits, and this is some actual data I pulled together from 9 and 15 clients. So when we do audits, we exhume data off of each endpoint that we're assessing, and that's what we call the CRA. So if you use the CRA as the pivot data point here, or the index key. So for example, in this first one, you see that 92 hosts were audited. From the data that we return with the audit, we could see that only 85 had their EDR installed or in use. We can see that only 59 had their antivirus. Only 50 had their help desk utility. But we could see beyond the 92 that we examined that there were another 14 active computers in the environment that had not been audited, that we have no visibility into their security posture by those products that they depend on. And we could see that in Active Directory, 143 had been enabled and used within 90 days of that audit. But you can see this is a common problem across these 15 client estates that we examined, and you can see it really doesn't change depending on the size of the estate. It's a common problem that if you rely on products for your security posture, rather than addressing the fundamentals, then you're going to have gaps in your observability. And those gaps are what are exploited by attackers. Let's just repeat. Now, boiling this all down to 3 monkeys incident response, and we're right at the end, and I apologize. But what I've experienced mostly with executives in the past is, I'll get called in by a CISO, CIO, maybe a risk and compliance manager, or especially when I'm called in by legal counsel, inside or outside. I've learned that you have to start with the question of what don't you want to know, because unfortunately that's how they approach risk management, limited liability, and it's not a good thing. And in fact, what I've learned from ransomware, that's what's being exploited. So some history. It wasn't until the ransomware as a service activities and campaigns of the past couple of years where the attackers realized that Three Monkeys was a risk management protocol practiced by executives. And it's not like they're trained at business school to do this, it's just what they do. But the past experiences of hacking, of DOS, of DDoS, APT, wipers, those were all left in the hands of the IS department or the IS functions, or IT largely. And risk management would then control the outcomes and the documentation and reporting on the impacts, and find ways to manipulate the data. And yes, I'm being critical, and rightfully so, about this, because I've lived this for the past 25 years. What ransomware actors are taking advantage of today, and indeed most bot masters, the theft of information from the environment that they then hold organizations hostage to through their extortion demands, is because they're exploiting this predilection that executives have to control the narrative, and they themselves are taking control of the narrative, so that they expose the facts of the compromise, the time, the impact, and they control the opportunity. So executive or corporate response to this now has become an insurance activity rather, and a corporate risk management activity, which is largely based on insurance, rather than trying to hush up the incident. And there may be a variety of different perspectives on this, but this is my own experience, that in the past, because risk management could control the narrative, they would limit the information that they shared with regulators, with prosecutors, with plaintiffs, even with employees about the incident. And that ultimately led to more deficiencies in security program management, less investment through awareness of program needs, and ultimately more exposure. And that is fundamentally and functionally what ransomware actors are today exploiting. It takes a village. So in the triage process and the incident response process, these are my own diagrams. I've learned that it's activities, not specific techniques, that lead to successful outcomes. And those activities have to engage with other functions that are impacted of the business, and strategic issues of the organization. So on the incident response cycle, you'll notice that detect, respond, remediate, and improve, communicate, investigate, process, and awareness. Those are organizational priorities, not and imperatives, not technical. The technical are just methods and mechanisms of achieving organizational outcomes. And insurance, I mentioned, is as the outcome. I'll just close with this. In order to have a successful outcome with an insurer, you've got to have a life cycle of prepare and respond. That means that the insurers will have a questionnaire for you to fill out. You should audit your response regularly and periodically against the questionnaire. And you should balance that with business impact assessments to understand the functional needs of security program both its hygiene and posture, as well as its appendage products that it relies on to achieve that hygiene and posture. And you should enable your responders with playbooks based upon those business impacts so that you can limit the claims. And all of this should be documented in a proactive program that demonstrates your governance.